When Sarah Mitchell walked into St. Mary's Hospital for her night shift on October 15, 2019, she appeared to be just another dedicated nurse ready to care for patients through the long, quiet hours of darkness. Her colleagues saw a gentle woman in scrubs, someone who spoke softly to frighten patients and always volunteered for the most difficult cases. What they didn't know was that beneath her compassionate exterior lay the heart and training of a warrior. For 8 years, Sarah had served as an Army Ranger in some of the world's most dangerous combat zones. She had navigated hostile territories, engaged in close-quarters combat, and saved countless lives under enemy fire. But those days were behind her now, or so she thought. She had traded her combat boots for comfortable nursing shoes, her rifle for a stethoscope, and her military uniform for hospital scrubs. She believed her fighting days were over. That belief would be shattered at 2:47 a.m. when a masked gunman burst through the emergency room doors, forever changing not just her life, but the lives of everyone in the hospital that night. In the span of 37 minutes, Sarah would be forced to call upon every skill she had learned in the military, every instinct honed in battle, and every ounce of courage that had carried her through the darkest moments of war. This is the true story of how a quiet night nurse became a hero, how military training never truly leaves your soul, and how sometimes the most ordinary-looking people carry the most extraordinary secrets. It's a story about duty, courage, and a thin line between the life you've lived and the life you thought you'd left behind. Sarah Mitchell adjusted her stethoscope around her neck as she walked through the automatic doors of St. Mary's Hospital. The October evening was crisp, with autumn leaves scattered across the parking lot like confetti from nature's celebration. She had been working as a night nurse in the intensive care unit for 3 years now, and the routine had become as comfortable as an old sweater. Clock in at 11, check patient charts, make rounds, administer medications, and keep watch over those who needed healing the most. The hospital corridors were quieter during the night shift, illuminated by the soft glow of fluorescent lights that hummed a gentle lullaby. Sarah preferred these hours. There was something peaceful about the way the hospital settled into its nighttime rhythm, like a great ship sailing through calm waters. The hustle and bustle of the day shift gave way to a more intimate atmosphere, where nurses could spend quality time with patients, where families gathered for difficult conversations, and where life and death decisions were made in whispered conferences. As she made her way to the nurses' station, Sarah greeted Maria, the charge nurse who was finishing up the evening shift. Maria was a veteran of 25 years, a woman whose weathered hands had comforted thousands of patients and whose kind eyes had seen every human drama imaginable. She looked up from her paperwork with a warm smile that crinkled the corners of her eyes. "Good evening, Sarah," Maria said, her voice carrying the slight accent of her Puerto Rican heritage. "We've got a full house tonight. Room 304 is the elderly gentleman with pneumonia, still struggling with his oxygen levels. Room 31 is the young mother who came in after the car accident, stable but worried about her children. And room 318 is Mr. Peterson, the veteran who's been asking for someone to talk to." Sarah nodded, mentally organizing her night ahead. She had always been good at compartmentalizing, a skill that had served her well in her previous life. "How's his pain level?" she asked, referring to Mr. Peterson. "Physical pain is manageable," Maria replied, lowering her voice. "It's the other kind that's keeping him awake. He mentioned something about Afghanistan, and you know how it is with our veterans. Sometimes they just need someone who understands." Sarah felt a familiar tightness in her chest. She understood more than Maria could possibly know. Mr. Peterson wasn't the first veteran she had cared for, and each time she encountered someone who had served, it was like looking into a mirror that reflected a version of herself she had carefully tucked away. The transition from military service to civilian life was never as clean as people imagined. You didn't just hang up your uniform and forget everything you had experienced, everything you had been trained to do. After receiving the complete handoff report, Sarah began her rounds. The ICU was a maze of sophisticated medical equipment, each room containing monitors that beeped and hummed with electronic precision. She moved through the ward with practiced efficiency, checking vital signs, adjusting IV drips, and offering comfort to those who were awake and anxious in the strange limbo between sleep and recovery. Her first stop was room 304, where 82-year-old Harold Watson lay connected to an oxygen mask, his breathing labored but steady. His daughter sat in the bedside chair, her hand resting gently on his arm. Sarah entered quietly, her soft-soled shoes making barely a whisper against the linoleum floor. "How are we doing tonight?" Sarah asked, her voice gentle and reassuring. "He's been restless," the daughter replied, exhaustion evident in her voice. "The doctor said his oxygen levels are improving, but he keeps trying to remove the mask." Sarah approached the bed and placed her hand on Harold's forehead, feeling for fever while also offering human contact. It was something she had learned in the military, how important touch could be for someone who was scared or disoriented. In combat, a steady hand on a wounded soldier's shoulder could mean the difference between panic and calm. "Mr. Watson," he said softly, "I'm Sarah, your night nurse. I know the mask is uncomfortable, but it's helping you breathe better. I'm going to check your oxygen levels, okay?" Harold's eyes opened, cloudy with medication and illness, but he nodded slightly. Sarah performed her assessment with gentle efficiency, noting improvements in his color and breathing pattern. She adjusted his position slightly to help with comfort and made notes in his chart. "His numbers are looking better," she told the daughter. "The antibiotics are doing their job. Try to get some rest yourself. I'll be checking on him regularly throughout the night." The daughter squeezed her father's hand and settled back into the chair. Sarah dimmed the lights slightly and moved on to her next patient, carrying with her the quiet satisfaction that came from providing comfort in a place where comfort was desperately needed. Room 311 held 28-year-old Jennifer Martinez, a single mother who had been brought in after a collision at an intersection. Her injuries were serious but not life-threatening, consisting mainly of a concussion, broken ribs, and various cuts and bruises. What concerned the medical staff more was her emotional state. Her 2 young children had been in the car with her, and while they had escaped with minor injuries, the trauma of the accident had left Jennifer in a state of anxious vigilance. "I need to call my babysitter," Jennifer said as soon as Sarah entered the room. "My kids were supposed to be picked up from school tomorrow, and I don't know if my sister got the message." Sarah pulled up a chair beside the bed, recognizing the signs of someone whose mind was racing with worry about responsibilities that couldn't be handled from a hospital bed. In the military, she'd seen soldiers with similar anxieties, men and women who were more concerned about their duties and their teams than their own injuries. "Let's take this one step at a time," Sarah said calmly. "Tell me about your children. What are their names?" "Miguel is 7 and Sophia is 5, Jennifer replied, her voice catching slightly. "They're staying with my neighbor, Mrs. Chen, but she's elderly and I don't want to burden her." Sarah listened patiently as Jennifer explained her situation. Single parenthood was a juggling act under the best of circumstances, and being hospitalized had thrown all the balls into the air. Sarah helped Jennifer make a list of phone calls that needed to be made and people who needed to be contacted. Sometimes healing began not with medication, but with peace of mind. "I'll speak with the social worker in the morning," Sarah assured her. "We have resources to help coordinate care for your children while you recover. Right now, your job is to rest and let your body heal." Jennifer's shoulders seemed to relax for the first time since Sarah had entered the room. "Thank you," she whispered. "I was so scared that I wouldn't be able to take care of them." "You're already taking care of them by taking care of yourself," Sarah replied. Strong mothers know when to ask for help. As she left Jennifer's room, Sarah reflected on how different this kind of caring was from the split-second medical decisions she had made in combat zones. In the military, medical care was often about rapid triage and immediate life-saving interventions. Here, it was about the slower, deeper work of healing that encompassed not just physical recovery, but emotional and social well-being as well. Her final stop was room 318, where 63-year-old Robert Peterson lay staring at the ceiling, his eyes wide with the kind of alertness that came from too many nights when sleep wouldn't come. His chart indicated he was recovering from surgery to repair a hernia, a routine procedure that should have had him comfortable and resting. But Sarah could see immediately that his restlessness had nothing to do with physical pain. "Mr. Peterson," she said softly as she entered the room, "I'm Sarah, your night nurse. Maria mentioned you've been having trouble sleeping." Robert turned his head toward her, and Sarah saw something in his eyes that she recognized immediately. It was the look of someone who had seen things that couldn't be unseen, who carried memories that visited uninvited in the quiet hours of the night. "Hard to sleep in strange places," he said simply. "Spent too many years sleeping with one eye open." Sarah nodded, understanding more than he knew. "Where did you serve?" she asked, settling into the bedside chair. "Afghanistan 2 tours. You?" The question came naturally, as if he had sensed something familiar in her demeanor. For a moment, Sarah hesitated. She had worked hard to separate her military identity from her nursing identity, to leave the soldier behind and embrace the healer. But sitting across from Robert, seeing the isolation that came from carrying experiences that most people couldn't understand, she made a decision. "Army," she said quietly. "Multiple deployments, various locations." Robert's posture changed slightly, the way it always did when veterans recognized each other. It was subtle but unmistakable, a straightening of the shoulders, a shift in attention, figured as much. "You move different than the other nurses." "More aware." They talked for nearly an hour. not about combat or trauma, but about the ordinary things that felt extraordinary when shared with someone who understood. They discussed the difficulty of explaining military experience to civilians, the challenge of finding purpose in peacetime, and the strange comfort that came from hospital routines that reminded them both of military structure and order. The hardest part, Robert said as Sarah prepared to continue her rounds, is feeling like nobody understands what it was like over there. Like I'm speaking a different language. You're not alone in that feeling, Sarah replied. And you're not alone here. I'll check on you again before dawn. As she left his room, Sarah felt the familiar weight of shared understanding. In the military, that connection with fellow service members had been automatic and essential. In civilian life, it was rarer but no less meaningful. She had found her place in nursing partly because it allowed her to use her medical training in service of others. But moments like this reminded her that her military experience would always be part of who she was. The rest of the night passed quietly. Sarah completed her rounds, administered medications, updated charts, and provided comfort to those who needed it. She helped a frightened patient's family member understand a difficult diagnosis, assisted another nurse with a complex procedure, and spent time with the elderly woman who was afraid of dying alone. By 2 a.m, the hospital had settled into its deepest quiet. The emergency room downstairs was experiencing a rare lull. The surgical suites were empty except for emergency procedures, and most patients were finally sleeping. Sarah found herself at the nurse's station, catching up on documentation and preparing for the morning shift change that was still hours away. It was during these quiet hours that she often reflected on the path that had brought her here. The transition from military service to nursing hadn't been immediate or easy. After her discharge, she had struggled with purpose and direction, unsure how to translate her experiences into civilian life. The GI Bill had made nursing school possible, and she had discovered that medical care felt familiar, even comforting. The structured environment, the clear protocols, and the mission of helping others had provided a bridge between her military identity and her civilian future. But nights like this, when she connected with patients like Robert, reminded her that she would never completely leave her military experience behind. It was woven into the fabric of who she was, informing how she approached challenges, how she assessed situations, and how she responded to crisis. She had thought that becoming a nurse meant leaving the warrior behind, but she was beginning to understand that the two identities didn't have to be separate. They could coexist, each strengthening the other. As she sat in the quiet glow of the nurse's station, updating patient charts and monitoring the gentle electronic symphony of medical equipment, Sarah felt a sense of peace. She had found her place in the world, a role that allowed her to serve others while honoring both her past and her present. The hospital felt like home in a way that nowhere else had since she had left the military. She had no way of knowing that in less than an hour, everything would change, that the quiet sanctuary of St. Mary's Hospital would become a battlefield, and that all of her carefully separated identities would collide in 37 minutes that would test every skill she had ever learned and every bit of courage she had ever possessed. The warrior she thought she had left behind was about to step forward, and Sarah Mitchell, the night nurse, was about to become someone she never expected to be again. The first sound was wrong. Sarah's head snapped up from the patient chart she was reviewing, her body responding to an instinct honed by years of training before her conscious mind had even processed what she'd heard. It was 2:47 a.m., and the sound that had broken the hospital's peaceful silence was the distinctive crash of safety glass shattering, followed immediately by shouting from the emergency room 3 floors below. Other nurses at the station looked up with concern, but Sarah was already moving. Her military training had taught her to recognize the difference between ordinary hospital emergencies and something far more dangerous. The pattern of sounds, the quality of the shouting, the way it cut through the building's ambient noise, all of it triggered alarms in her mind that had nothing to do with medical emergencies and everything to do with active threats. "Did you hear that?" asked Janet, one of the other night nurses, her voice filled with confusion rather than alarm. Sarah was already reaching for the phone to call security when the hospital's public address system crackled to life. Code Silver, all units. Code Silver, emergency room. This is not a drill. The announcement sent a chill through the ICU. Code Silver was the hospital's designation for a weapon or hostage situation. It was a code that everyone hoped they would never hear, and most of the staff had only encountered it during mandatory training drills. But Sarah had heard similar announcements before, in different contexts and different languages, and she knew that the next few minutes would determine whether people lived or died. "Everyone listen carefully," Sarah said, her voice cutting through the sudden chaos of panicked whispers and confused questions. The other nurses turned to her, and something in her tone, The authority and calm certainty commanded immediate attention. We need to secure this floor immediately. Janet, call the elevator control and have them shut down all passenger elevators except for emergency personnel. Lisa, start moving all ambulatory patients away from windows and into interior rooms. Monica, get on the phone with each patient room and tell them to stay in bed and remain quiet.
Sarah, what?
Janet began. Do it now, Sarah interrupted, her voice carrying a command authority that surprised even her. Every second counts. As the other nurses scrambled to follow her instructions, Sarah's mind was already working through tactical possibilities. Code Silver meant an armed individual in the emergency room, but that didn't mean the threat was contained there. Hospitals were complex buildings with multiple access points, stairwells, and corridors. An armed individual could reach other floors within minutes, and the ICU, with its vulnerable patients and limited escape routes, could become a death trap. Sarah moved quickly to the supply closet where she knew emergency equipment was stored. Her hands found what she was looking for, a heavy-duty flashlight that could serve as both illumination and a weapon if necessary, and a set of master keys that would allow her to lock down sections of the ward. As she gathered these items, her mind automatically began calculating distances, identifying cover positions, and mapping potential defensive strategies. The training that had kept her alive in Afghanistan was taking over, and for the first time in 3 years, Sarah felt the familiar shift in consciousness that came with the transition from peacetime to combat mindset. Her senses became hyperacute, her movements more fluid and purposeful, and her thinking shifted from the methodical pace of nursing care to the rapid-fire decision-making of tactical operations. Down in the emergency room, the situation was deteriorating rapidly. Through the hospital's internal communication system, Sarah could hear fragments of what was happening. An armed man had entered through the main emergency entrance, shouting about inadequate care for his father who had died in the hospital 6 months earlier. Initial reports indicated he was armed with at least one handgun and had already fired shots, though whether anyone had been hit was unclear. Sarah made her way to the central nurses' station where she could coordinate the floor's response. The other nurses were following her instructions, but she could see the fear in their eyes and the uncertainty in their movements. They were medical professionals, trained to save lives and provide comfort, not to respond to armed threats. This was outside their realm of experience, but it was exactly the kind of situation Sarah had trained for in the military. Lisa, what's the status on patient relocation?
Sarah asked, her voice calm despite the adrenaline coursing through her system.
Most of the ambulatory patients are moved to interior rooms, Lisa replied, her voice shaking slightly. But Mr. Peterson in 318 is asking questions, and Mrs. Watson in 34 can't be moved because of his oxygen dependency. This is the book. It's about history. Peterson in 318 is asking questions, and Mrs. Watson in 34 can't be moved because of his oxygen dependency. Sarah nodded, processing this information quickly. Mr. Peterson, the veteran, would understand the situation once she explained it to him. He might even be an asset if the threat reached their floor. But Harold Watson presented a problem. Moving a patient on supplemental oxygen was possible but risky, and doing it quickly enough to maintain security was challenging.
How many security guards are on duty tonight?
She asked Monica, who was still on the phone with hospital administration.
2. Monica replied, covering the phone.
Both are responding to the emergency room. The police have been called, but response time is estimated at 5 to 8 minutes. 8 minutes might as well be 8 hours in a situation like this. Sarah had seen how quickly violence could escalate and spread through a building. If the gunman decided to move beyond the emergency room, he could reach the ICU in less than 2 minutes using the stairwells. The hospital's security measures, designed primarily to prevent theft and manage difficult patients, would be inadequate against a determined armed individual. Sarah made a decision that would have seemed impossible to her colleagues just minutes earlier. She was going to have to become someone she thought she had left behind. I need everyone to listen very carefully, she told the assembled nurses. I have military training that's relevant to this situation. I'm going to coordinate our response, and I need you to trust me and follow my instructions exactly. Can you do that? The nurses nodded, clinging to the authority and confidence in Sarah's voice like lifelines in a storm. They might not understand where her certainty was coming from, but in the face of unimaginable crisis, they were grateful to have someone who seemed to know what to do. First, we're going to create a secure zone, Sarah continued. Lisa, I need you to lock all the doors that access this wing except for the main entrance, which we'll monitor. Janet, get blankets and pillows and create a safe area in the break room where mobile patients can shelter. Monica, I want you to establish communication with each patient room and make sure everyone understands they need to remain quiet and out of sight.
As the nurses dispersed to carry out her orders, Sarah allowed herself a moment to acknowledge the weight of what was happening.
She was taking command of a civilian medical facility using military protocols, making life and death decisions for people who trusted her, and preparing to potentially use skills she had hoped never to need again. But there was no time for self-doubt or hesitation. People's lives hung in the balance. The hospital's communication system crackled again with updates from the emergency room. The gunman had barricaded himself in one of the treatment areas with several hostages, including medical staff and patients. He was demanding to speak with the doctor who had treated his father, but that physician was not on duty and lived 40 minutes away. The police were setting up a perimeter outside the building, but the delicate nature of the hostage situation meant that immediate intervention was not possible. Sarah processed this information with growing concern. Barricaded hostage situations were notoriously unpredictable. The gunman was clearly emotionally unstable, grieving, and angry. These factors made him dangerous not just to his immediate hostages, but to anyone in the hospital. If negotiations broke down or if he felt cornered, he might decide to expand his area of control or seek out additional targets. She made her way to room 318, where Robert Peterson was lying awake, clearly aware that something serious was happening.
As she entered his room, she could see in his eyes that he had already assessed the situation and come to similar conclusions about the level of threat they were facing. "Weapons in the building," he said simply.
It wasn't a question. Armed individual in the emergency room, Sarah confirmed. Hostage situation. I need to know if you're capable of moving quickly if necessary. Robert sat up in bed, wincing slightly from his surgical site but moving with purpose. What do you need? Sarah studied him carefully, weighing the risks of involving a patient in their defense against the potential benefits of having another person with relevant training. I need another set of eyes and someone who understands tactical thinking, but you're recovering from surgery. I'm fine, Robert replied firmly. What's your military background? Army Ranger, multiple deployments.
Medical training.
Sarah said, automatically falling into the abbreviated communication style of military briefings. Robert nodded with understanding. Infantry, 2 tours Afghanistan. I can move. Sarah made another calculated decision. Get dressed, slowly and quietly. I may need your help securing this floor. As Robert began carefully getting out of bed, Sarah's radio, borrowed from hospital security, crackled with an update that made her blood run cold. The gunman had left the emergency room. Security cameras had lost track of him somewhere in the hospital's main corridor system. He was mobile, armed, and his location was unknown. Sarah immediately switched to high alert. An armed mobile threat in an environment filled with vulnerable patients and unarmed staff represented the worst-case scenario she had been mentally preparing for. She quickly returned to the nurse's station where her team was waiting for instructions. The situation has escalated, she announced. The individual has left the emergency room, and his location is unknown. We're going to implement lockdown protocols immediately. Sarah began issuing rapid-fire instructions that drew on years of military training in base defense and protection of vulnerable assets. Janet, I need you to coordinate with each patient room and make sure every door is locked. If anyone doesn't have internal locks, barricade the doors with furniture. Lisa, shut off all non-essential lights in the corridors. We want to make this floor look empty and uninteresting. Monica, establish a communication protocol where you check in with each room every 10 minutes. If anyone doesn't respond, alert me immediately. The nurses moved with new purpose, no longer confused or hesitant, but focused on executing clear, actionable instructions. Sarah had managed to transform their fear into productive action by giving them specific tasks and a sense of control over their situation. Sarah positioned herself at the main entrance to the ICU wing, a location that provided her with a clear view of the corridor while offering cover behind the solid construction of the nurses' station. From this position, she could monitor the floor's security while remaining in communication with her team and the hospital administration. Robert Peterson appeared at her side, moving carefully but steadily. He had managed to dress in his street clothes and had brought with him a walking stick from the hospital's patient equipment. It wasn't much of a weapon, but it was better than nothing, and Sarah could see in his bearing that he was thinking tactically about their situation. What's our defensive strategy? He asked quietly. Sarah appreciated his directness and military understanding of their circumstances. Primary objective is patient protection. Secondary is denial of access to this floor. If he makes it up here, we channel him away from patient areas and toward the stairwell exit. Robert nodded. studying the floor layout with experienced eyes.
Choke points? Main corridor intersection, Sarah replied, pointing to a location about 30 yards from their current position.
Single access point to the patient rooms, good sight lines, hardcover available. They were interrupted by another announcement over the hospital communication system.
The police had established contact with the gunman, who was now believed to be in the hospital's main lobby area. He was demanding to speak with hospital administration about what he perceived as negligent care that had led to his father's death.
The negotiations were ongoing, but the situation remained unstable and dangerous. Sarah felt a mixture of relief and continued tension.
Relief that the gunman wasn't heading directly toward the ICU, but tension because she knew that unstable individuals in crisis situations were unpredictable. His demands might not be met. Negotiations could break down, or he might simply decide to escalate the situation by seeking out new targets or trying to cause maximum disruption to the hospital.
We maintain our defensive posture, she told Robert and the nursing team. Until we get an all clear from police, we treat this as an active threat. The next hour passed in a state of controlled tension.
Sarah rotated between monitoring the main entrance, checking on patient welfare, and coordinating with hospital security and police who were managing the situation downstairs. Her military training served her well during this period, providing her with the mental framework to maintain alertness without becoming overwhelmed by stress or fear. The patients, despite their confusion about the unusual late-night activity, generally cooperated with the lockdown procedures. Harold Watson in room 304 slept through most of the crisis, his oxygen-dependent condition actually providing some protection since he was unlikely to become mobile and expose himself to danger. Jennifer Martinez in room 311 was frightened but remained calm when Sarah explained that security measures were in place for everyone's protection. At 3:24 a.m., the hospital's communication system delivered the news everyone had been waiting for. Code Silver, all clear. Code Silver, all clear. The situation has been resolved. Normal operations may resume. Sarah felt her shoulders drop as the tension of the past 37 minutes began to release. The gunman had been taken into custody by police negotiators without further violence. No one had been seriously injured during the incident, and the hostages in the emergency room were safe.
But as Sarah looked around at her colleagues and reflected on what had just happened, she realized that something fundamental had changed. For 37 minutes, she had been forced to merge her military identity with her nursing identity in ways she had never imagined. She had taken command of a civilian medical facility, made tactical decisions about patient safety, and prepared to use combat skills in defense of vulnerable people. The experience had revealed something important about herself and her journey from soldier to nurse. The two identities weren't separate after all. They were different facets of the same core commitment to service and protection of others. The skills that had kept her alive and effective in combat zones could also be used to protect and serve in civilian settings. As the ICU gradually returned to normal operations and the patients settled back into their rest, Sarah found herself changed by the night's events. She had discovered that leaving the military didn't mean abandoning everything she had learned and become. It meant finding new ways to use those skills in service of others and being ready to call upon them when circumstances demanded it. The quiet night nurse had revealed herself to be something more complex and powerful, and that revelation would reshape how she understood her purpose and her place in the world. The aftermath of Code Silver brought an eerie calm to St. Mary's Hospital that felt heavier than the previous night's peaceful quiet. As dawn approached and the crisis officially ended, Sarah found herself standing in the same position at the nurses' station where she had coordinated the ICU's defense. But everything felt different now. The familiar hospital sound seemed sharper, the corridors appeared more vulnerable, and she couldn't shake the hypervigilance that had kept her alert through 37 minutes of potential danger. Robert Peterson sat in a nearby chair, his walking stick resting against his leg, watching Sarah with the understanding that came from shared experience. He had recognized something in her during the crisis that went far beyond typical nursing training, and now, in the quiet after the storm, he was waiting to see how she would process what had just happened.
"You did good tonight," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of someone who understood the complexity of leadership under pressure. "That wasn't nursing school training."
Sarah turned to look at him, still feeling the residual adrenaline coursing through her system.
For 3 years, she had carefully maintained the separation between her military past and her nursing present, but tonight had shattered that artificial barrier. There was no point in pretending anymore that she was just another night nurse who happened to have good instincts. 8 years. Army Rangers, she said simply. 3 deployments to Afghanistan, 2 to Iraq. Medical specialist and tactical operations. Robert nodded slowly, processing this information against what he had observed during the crisis. That explains the command presence. When did you get out? 4 years ago. Use the GI Bill for nursing school.
Sarah paused, looking around the ICU that had been her peaceful sanctuary just hours earlier. I thought I was done with all of that. You're never done with it, Robert replied.
It's part of who you are. Tonight proved that. But
the conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Dr. Patricia Reyes, the chief medical officer, who had been called in to manage the hospital's response to the crisis.
Dr. Reyes was a composed woman in her 50s, with silver hair and the kind of calm authority that came from 30 years of medical practice. She approached Sarah and Robert with a mixture of gratitude and curiosity.
Nurse Mitchell,
She said, extending her hand.
I've been hearing remarkable things about how you managed the ICU during the emergency. Security tells me that your quick thinking and organization likely prevented a much worse outcome if the situation had escalated to this floor.
Sarah accepted the handshake, unsure how to respond. She had simply done what her training had taught her to do, but she was beginning to understand that her actions had been far outside the normal scope of nursing practice.
I just followed emergency protocols, Dr. Reyes. According to the other nurses, you created emergency protocols. Doctor,
Reyes replied. They said you took command of the situation with an authority and expertise they'd never seen before.
Where did that training come from? Sarah hesitated for a moment, then decided that the night's events had already revealed her secret to anyone who was paying attention.
I'm a former Army Ranger. Dr.
Reyes. I served multiple combat deployments before transitioning to nursing. Dr. Reyes's eyebrows rose slightly, but her expression remained professional and interested rather than surprised.
That explains a great deal. Have you considered that your unique background might be valuable to this hospital in ways beyond bedside nursing?
Before Sarah could respond, Janet approached the group with a concerned expression.
She had been monitoring the news coverage of the hospital incident and had discovered something that made the night's events even more significant than they had initially realized.
Sarah, you need to see this, Janet said, holding up her smartphone.
The local news is covering the story, and they're calling you a hero. Someone took video of you coordinating the ICU response.
Sarah took the phone and watched a shaky cell phone video that someone had apparently recorded from one of the patient rooms.
The video showed her moving through the ICU with purposeful efficiency, directing other nurses, checking security positions, and coordinating with hospital administration. What struck her most was how different she looked in the video compared to how she thought of herself. This wasn't the gentle, soft-spoken night nurse her colleagues knew. This was someone who moved with military precision and spoke with command authority.
The news report was describing her as a former Army Ranger who had used her military training to protect patients and staff during the crisis. They had somehow obtained basic information about her service record and were presenting her as an example of how veterans could use their skills in civilian professions.
The reporter was calling for more recognition of the unique value that former military personnel brought to essential services like healthcare. How did they get this information? Sarah asked, feeling a mixture of pride and discomfort about the sudden public attention.
Hospital administration provided a statement, Dr. Reyes explained. In situations like this, we often highlight the extraordinary actions of our staff. Your background and response tonight are exactly the kind of story that helps people understand the caliber of professionals working in healthcare.
Sarah felt overwhelmed by the rapid transition from anonymous night nurse to local news story. For 3 years, she had worked to blend into civilian life, to be seen simply as a healthcare professional rather than as a former soldier.
Now her military identity was being broadcast to the entire community, and she wasn't sure how she felt about that level of exposure. Robert stood up carefully, supporting himself with his walking stick, and placed a gentle hand on Sarah's shoulder.
"This is what happens when you stop hiding who you are," he said. "People see your real value."
Over the next few hours, as the day shift arrived and the hospital returned to normal operations, Sarah found herself dealing with reactions that ranged from admiration to curiosity to a few expressions of discomfort from colleagues who seemed unsure how to process the revelation about her background. Some of the nurses who had worked with her for 3 years admitted they felt like they were meeting her for the first time.
Dr. Reyes asked Sarah to attend a debriefing meeting with hospital administration, security, and police representatives to discuss how the ICU had responded to the crisis.
Sarah found herself in the unusual position of explaining tactical decisions to people who had little understanding of military operations but who recognized that her actions had been effective. You essentially created a defensive perimeter around vulnerable patients, said Detective Mike Rodriguez, the lead investigator on the case. Your quick thinking about elevator control and floor security probably prevented casualties if the gunman had made it to your area. It was basic force protection, Sarah replied, using military terminology without thinking. When you have vulnerable assets and limited defensive capabilities, you create secure zones and control access points. The police officers in the room exchanged glances, recognizing professional competence when they heard it. Hospital administrators looked impressed but slightly bewildered by the military efficiency that had taken over their medical facility during the crisis. We'd like to discuss with you the possibility of developing better emergency response protocols for the hospital, Dr. Reyes said. Your experience suggests that our current procedures might not be adequate for situations involving armed threats. Sarah realized that the night's events were leading towards something she hadn't anticipated. Her careful separation of military and nursing identities was not just being dismantled, it was being replaced by something new, an integration that could benefit both her career and the hospital's mission. I'd be interested in that conversation, she replied carefully. But I want to make sure that any role I take on doesn't compromise my patient care responsibilities. On the contrary, Dr. Reyes said, I think it could enhance them. Nurses who understand crisis management and emergency response are exactly what we need in today's healthcare environment. After the meeting, Sarah returned to the ICU to finish her shift and found that word about her military background had spread throughout the hospital. Colleagues she barely knew were stopping by to thank her for her actions during the crisis, and several of them shared that they were military spouses or veterans themselves who appreciated having someone on staff who understood their experiences. Jennifer Martinez, the young mother who was recovering from the car accident, asked Sarah to sit with her for a few minutes. Jennifer had been awake during much of the crisis and had overheard enough of the emergency communications to understand what had happened. I wanted to thank you, Jennifer said. I know you kept us safe last night, but I also wanted to ask you something.
Sarah settled into the bedside chair, curious about what Jennifer wanted to discuss.
My brother is coming home from deployment next month, Jennifer continued.
He's been overseas for 2 years, and our family doesn't really know how to help him transition back to civilian life. After seeing how you handled last night and learning about your background, I wondered if you might have advice. Sarah felt a familiar tightness in her chest.
This was exactly the kind of conversation she had avoided for years, the kind of discussion about military transition that reminded her of her own difficult journey from soldier to civilian. But sitting across from Jennifer, seeing the genuine concern for her brother's well-being, Sarah realized that her reluctance to discuss her military experience had prevented her from helping people who could benefit from her perspective.
Transitioning is different for everyone, Sarah said carefully. But the most important thing is that he knows he's not alone, and that his family supports him, even if they don't fully understand what he's been through.
They talked for 20 minutes about the challenges of military transition, about finding purpose and identity in civilian life, and about the importance of patience with the adjustment process. Sarah found herself sharing insights that she had gained through her own difficult transition, perspectives that she had never offered to anyone because she had been so focused on leaving her military identity behind.
As her shift ended and she prepared to drive home, Sarah reflected on how much had changed in a single night. The crisis had forced her to confront the artificial separation she had created between her past and present, and to recognize that her military experience wasn't something to be hidden or overcome, but rather something that could enhance her ability to serve others in her civilian career.
She stopped by room 318 to check on Robert Peterson one final time before leaving. He was sitting up in bed looking remarkably better despite the eventful night, and he greeted her with a knowing smile. How are you feeling about all this? He asked. Sarah considered the question carefully. Confused, I think. For 3 years I've been trying to be someone different. Someone who wasn't defined by military service. But last night you discovered that you can be both, Robert finished. You can be a nurse who happens to be a veteran, or a veteran who happens to be a nurse. They're not mutually exclusive. Sarah nodded slowly, beginning to understand the truth in his words.
I think I've been afraid that admitting to my military background would somehow diminish my credibility as a nurse, or that people would see me as more warrior than healer. What you are, Robert said firmly, is someone who has committed her life to protecting and caring for others, whether that's been with a medical kit in a combat zone or with a stethoscope in a hospital.
The tools change, but the mission is the same. As Sarah finally left the hospital that morning, walking out into the bright October sunshine that seemed almost startling after the night's dramatic events, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years, a sense of wholeness.
The fragmented identity she had carried since leaving the military, the careful separation between who she had been and who she was trying to become,
was beginning to integrate into something more complete and authentic. She knew that returning to work would bring new challenges as she navigated her colleagues' changing perceptions and her own evolving understanding of her role. The hospital administration's interest in involving her in emergency planning would require her to step into a more visible leadership position that combined her clinical skills with her tactical knowledge. But for the first time since leaving the military, Sarah felt ready to embrace all aspects of her identity and experience. The night nurse who had hidden her warrior past was becoming someone new. A healthcare professional who could draw on the full range of her skills and experience in service of others. The secret was out, and rather than feeling exposed or vulnerable, Sarah felt liberated and ready to discover what this new integration of her identities might make possible. 3 weeks after the incident at St. Mary's Hospital, Sarah found herself sitting in Dr. Ray's office looking at preliminary plans for a comprehensive emergency response training program that would fundamentally change how the hospital prepared for crisis situations. The documents spread across the conference table represented something she had never imagined possible, a formal integration of her military expertise with her nursing career. The media attention following the Code Silver incident had gradually faded, but its impact on Sarah's professional life had continued to grow. Hospital administration had spent the intervening weeks consulting with emergency management experts, reviewing the incident response, and developing proposals for enhanced security and emergency protocols. At the center of all these discussions was Sarah's unique combination of clinical knowledge and tactical training. What we're proposing, Reyes explained, is a new position that would make you our Director of Emergency Preparedness and Crisis Response. You would maintain your clinical duties but also be responsible for developing training programs, coordinating with local law enforcement, and ensuring that all hospital staff are prepared for various emergency scenarios. Sarah studied the job description, feeling a mixture of excitement and apprehension. The position would formalize something that had emerged naturally during the crisis, her ability to bridge the gap between civilian healthcare and emergency response capabilities. But it would also mean stepping into a leadership role that would make her military background a central part of her professional identity, rather than a hidden aspect of her past. I'm interested, Sarah said carefully, but I want to make sure this doesn't become about militarizing healthcare. The hospital's primary mission is healing, not defense. That's exactly why you're the right person for this role, Dr. Reyes replied. You understand both the military and medical perspectives. We need someone who can develop security protocols that protect patients and staff without compromising the therapeutic environment that makes healing possible. The conversation was interrupted by a knock on the office door. Jennifer Martinez entered, walking carefully but steadily, her recovery from the car accident nearly complete. She had asked to meet with Sarah before her final discharge from the hospital, but Sarah hadn't expected her to seek out this meeting in Dr. Reyes' office. I hope I'm not interrupting, Jennifer said, but I wanted to speak with both of you about something important. Dr. Reyes gestured for Jennifer to join them at the conference table. Of course, Mrs. Martinez.
How are you feeling?
Much better, thanks to the excellent care I've received, Jennifer replied, but her attention quickly turned to Sarah. I actually wanted to talk about my brother Miguel's homecoming from deployment. Sarah remembered their earlier conversation about Jennifer's brother and his upcoming transition to civilian life. She had provided some general advice about supporting returning veterans, but she hadn't expected to hear more about the situation. He came home last week, Jennifer continued, and our family followed your advice about patience and support. But something happened yesterday that made me realize how important it is for people to know about your background and your story. Jennifer went on to explain that her brother had been struggling with the adjustment to civilian life, feeling disconnected from his family and uncertain about his place in a world that seemed to have moved on without him. He had been reluctant to seek help, believing that his difficulties were a sign of weakness or failure. When I told him about what happened here, about how you used your military training to protect people in a civilian setting, something changed, Jennifer said. He realized that his military experience wasn't something to be ashamed of or to hide, but something that could be valuable in his civilian career. Reyes listened with interest as Jennifer described how Sarah's example had inspired her brother to explore career options that would allow him to use his military skills in civilian service, including emergency management, healthcare, and public safety. He's enrolling in an EMT program next month, Jennifer concluded. He says that if you can be a warrior and a healer, then maybe he can find a way to serve his community using the skills he learned in the military.
Sarah felt moved by this unexpected connection between her own journey and that of someone she had never met.
It reminded her of something Robert Peterson had said during their conversations about the importance of veterans sharing their experiences and supporting each other through the transition to civilian life. I'm glad I could help in some way, Sarah said.
But you should tell your brother that his decision to seek out ways to serve his community is what makes the difference, not the example of any one person. After Jennifer left, Dr. Reyes turned back to Sarah with renewed enthusiasm about the emergency preparedness position. "This is exactly what I'm talking about," she said. "Your story doesn't just impact this hospital, it impacts the broader community."
Veterans need to see examples of successful transition, and civilian organizations need to understand the value that former military personnel can bring to their missions. Sarah realized that accepting this position would mean accepting a level of visibility and responsibility that went beyond her personal comfort zone.
It would make her not just a nurse with a military background, but a public example of successful veteran transition and an advocate for integrating military skills into civilian healthcare. "I need to ask you something honestly," Sarah said.
Are you offering me this position because of my qualifications or because of the media attention from the incident? Dr. Reyes met her gaze directly.
"I'm offering you this position because you have a unique combination of clinical expertise, tactical training, and leadership capability that our hospital needs. The media attention demonstrated your value to the broader community, but your qualifications are what make you the right person for this job."
Sarah appreciated the directness of the answer, but she still had concerns about taking on such a visible role. For 3 years, she had found peace in the quiet professionalism of night nursing, the ability to help people without drawing attention to herself or her background.
This new position would require her to step into the spotlight and become a spokesperson for veteran integration in healthcare. "I'd like to suggest a trial period," Sarah said.
6 months where I develop and implement initial training programs while maintaining my clinical duties. At the end of that period, we can evaluate whether this approach is working for both the hospital and for me.
Dr. Reyes agreed to the trial period, and they spent the next hour outlining the initial goals for the emergency preparedness program. Sarah would work with local law enforcement to develop realistic training scenarios, create protocols for various types of emergencies, and provide specialized training for hospital staff on crisis response and patient protection. As she left Dr.
Reyes's office, Sarah felt a sense of anticipation mixed with uncertainty. She was about to embark on a professional path that she could never have imagined when she first entered nursing school. The careful separation she had maintained between her military and civilian identities was not just dissolving, it was being replaced by something entirely new. The following Monday, Sarah reported to work for her first day in the dual role of night nurse and emergency preparedness coordinator.
She had arranged to split her time between clinical duties and program development, a schedule that would allow her to maintain her patient care responsibilities while building the new emergency preparedness initiative. Her first task was to meet with the hospital security team to assess current protocols and identify areas for improvement. The security chief, a former police officer named Tom Bradley, had requested the meeting after learning about Sarah's background and her role in the Code Silver response. "I've got to be honest with you," Tom said as they toured the hospital's security systems. "When I heard they were bringing in a nurse to help with emergency planning, I was skeptical. But after what you pulled off during the incident, I'm ready to learn whatever you can teach us." Sarah appreciated his candor and his willingness to collaborate. "I'm not here to take over security operations," he assured him. "I'm here to help bridge the gap between security protocols and patient care needs. Sometimes what works for building security doesn't work for a medical environment, and sometimes medical priorities conflict with security requirements."
They spent several hours walking through the hospital, identifying vulnerabilities and discussing scenarios that might require coordinated responses between security, medical staff, and external emergency services. Sarah found herself naturally thinking in terms of layered defense, evacuation routes, and communication protocols, but always with the awareness that this was a healing environment that needed to remain welcoming and therapeutic even while being secure.
One of their stops was the ICU, where Sarah had coordinated the emergency response 3 weeks earlier. Several of her former colleagues were on duty, and they greeted her with a mixture of familiarity and newfound respect.
Janet, the nurse who had helped implement Sarah's emergency protocols, approached them with obvious curiosity about Sarah's new role. "Are you still going to be working with patients?" Janet asks.
"I know the other nurses were worried that you might be moving completely into administration." "I'll be splitting my time," Sarah replied. "Patient care is still my primary mission."
The emergency planning work is meant to support that mission, not replace it. Janet seemed relieved by this answer, and Sarah realized that her colleagues' concerns reflected a broader question about how her new responsibilities would change her relationships and her identity within the hospital community.
She was determined to remain connected to direct patient care, both because she valued that work
and because she believed her credibility as an emergency preparedness coordinator depended on her continued engagement with the realities of clinical practice. That evening, Sarah returned to her regular nursing duties on the night shift, but with a new awareness of the hospital's security and emergency response systems.
She found herself unconsciously noting escape routes, assessing the vulnerability of different patient populations, and thinking about how quickly emergency protocols could be implemented during various shifts and circumstances. Robert Peterson had been discharged the previous week, but he had left Sarah a note thanking her not just for her medical care, but for helping him understand that his military experience remained valuable in civilian life.
He had mentioned that he was exploring volunteer opportunities with veteran service organizations, inspired by their conversations about using military skills in service of community needs. As Sarah made her rounds that night, checking on patients and providing care, she reflected on how much her understanding of her role had evolved since the Code Silver incident. She was still the same gentle, compassionate nurse who had found peace in the quiet hours of night shift medicine. But now she was also someone who could draw on the full range of her experience and training when circumstances required it.
Her final stop of the evening was the break room, where she sat down to complete the paperwork for her patient assessments and to review the initial outline for the emergency preparedness training program she would begin developing the next week. As she worked, Sarah felt a sense of integration and purpose that she hadn't experienced since leaving the military.
The warrior and the healer were no longer separate identities that she had to choose between or keep apart. They were complementary aspects of her commitment to protecting and caring for others, different tools and service of the same fundamental mission. The night nurse's secret wasn't just that she had military training, it was that she had discovered a way to honor all aspects of her experience in service of others.
Sarah's journey from hidden veteran to integrated healthcare professional was just beginning, but already she could see how her story might inspire other veterans to find ways to use their military experience in civilian careers. More importantly, she could see how her unique background could make St.
Mary's Hospital a safer, more prepared environment for patients and staff who trusted the institution with their lives and well-being. The secret was out, and it was becoming something much more valuable than she had ever imagined possible. 6 months after the Code Silver incident that changed everything, Sarah Mitchell stood before an audience of healthcare professionals, emergency responders, and hospital administrators from across the region. The annual Healthcare Emergency Preparedness Conference had invited her to present the results of St. Mary's Hospital's innovative integration of military expertise into civilian medical emergency protocols. As she looked out at the audience, Sarah felt a profound sense of how far she had traveled from the night nurse who had hidden her military background behind a carefully constructed civilian identity. The presentation she was about to give represented more than just a professional achievement. It was the culmination of a personal journey that had transformed her understanding of identity, service, and the ways that different kinds of experience could complement rather than compete with each other. The trial period for her dual role as nurse and emergency preparedness coordinator had been so successful that Dr. Reyes had made the position permanent, and other hospitals were now seeking to replicate their model. When I transitioned from military service to nursing, Sarah began her presentation. I believed I was leaving one identity behind to embrace another.
I thought that becoming a healer meant abandoning the warrior, that success in civilian healthcare required me to forget everything I had learned in combat zones. What I discovered during a crisis situation 6 months ago was that this separation was not only unnecessary, it was counterproductive.
Sarah's presentation detailed how St. Mary's Hospital had developed a comprehensive emergency preparedness program that combined traditional healthcare emergency protocols with tactical training and crisis management techniques adapted from military operations. The program had reduced emergency response times by 40%, improved staff confidence in crisis situations by 70%, and created a model for hospital security that maintained the therapeutic environment while significantly enhancing patient and staff safety. The key insight, Sarah explained, was recognizing that military training and healthcare practice share fundamental values: protection of vulnerable populations, rapid response to emergency situations, clear communication under pressure, and the ability to make life and death decisions with limited information and resources. The audience listened intently as Sarah described specific training exercises that had been developed for hospital staff, including simulation scenarios that taught nurses and doctors how to secure patient areas during security threats, how to maintain medical care during facility lockdowns, and how to coordinate with law enforcement and emergency services during complex incidents. One of the most innovative aspects of the program was the creation of a veteran healthcare worker support network within the hospital. Sarah had discovered that St. Mary's employed dozens of staff members with military backgrounds, from nurses and technicians to administrators and support personnel, but most of them had never discussed their service with colleagues or considered how their military experience might enhance their civilian healthcare work.
We found that when veterans in healthcare settings are encouraged to integrate their military experience with their civilian roles rather than compartmentalize them, both the individuals and the institutions benefit.
Veterans bring unique perspectives on crisis management, team coordination, and performance under pressure that can enhance healthcare delivery in unexpected ways. Dr. Patricia Reyes, who was also presenting at the conference, took the microphone to describe the institutional impact of the program.
Sarah's work has transformed not just our emergency preparedness but our entire approach to staff development and institutional resilience. We've discovered that many of our most effective healthcare workers have military backgrounds, and supporting them in integrating those experiences has improved job satisfaction, retention, and overall performance.
The questions from the audience revealed both enthusiasm for the model and concerns about implementation. Several attendees asked about the potential for militarization of healthcare environments, worried that introducing tactical training and security protocols might compromise the welcoming therapeutic atmosphere that hospitals needed to maintain.
Sarah addressed these concerns directly. The goal is never to militarize healthcare, but to enhance the safety and security that make healing possible.
Every protocol we develop is evaluated not just for its effectiveness in crisis situations, but for its impact on patient care and the therapeutic environment. We're not training hospital staff to be soldiers. We're training them to be more prepared and confident healthcare providers. After her formal presentation, Sarah was approached by several conference attendees who wanted to discuss their own experiences with veteran integration in healthcare settings. Among them was Dr. James Chen, an emergency room physician who had served as a Navy corpsman before attending medical school. "I've been hiding my military background for 15 years, Dr. Chen admitted. "I was afraid that colleagues would see me as too aggressive or militaristic for medicine. But after hearing your presentation, I'm wondering if I've been wasting valuable experience that could help me be a better doctor." Sarah recognized the familiar struggle in Dr. Chen's words, the same conflict between military and civilian identities that she had experienced for years. "The integration doesn't happen overnight," she assured him. "And it doesn't mean announcing your military background to everyone you meet. It means finding ways to use all of your experience in service of your patients and your profession." They were joined by Captain Lisa Rodriguez, a military nurse who was preparing to transition to civilian healthcare after completing her active duty commitment. Captain Rodriguez had heard about Sarah's story through military networks and had specifically attended the conference to learn about successful veteran transition strategies. "What was the hardest part of the integration process?" Captain Rodriguez asked. "I'm worried about how civilian colleagues will react to my military background." Sarah considered the question carefully, thinking back to her own fears and uncertainties during the early stages of her transition. "The hardest part was giving myself permission to be proud of my military service, while also embracing my identity as a civilian healthcare provider. I spent years thinking I had to choose between them, when what I needed was to find ways to honor both." The conversation continued over lunch, where Sarah found herself surrounded by healthcare workers who were eager to discuss veteran transition, military skill integration, and the challenges of bridging military and civilian professional cultures. She realized that her presentation had tapped into a much broader need in the healthcare community for better understanding of how to support veteran employees and leverage their unique skills and experiences. Later that afternoon, Sarah attended a panel discussion about innovation in healthcare emergency management, where she was surprised to hear her name mentioned by several other presenters as an example of creative thinking in crisis preparedness. The St. Mary's Hospital model was being cited as a case study in how healthcare institutions could adapt military expertise to civilian needs without compromising their primary mission of patient care. During a break between sessions, Sarah received a phone call from Jennifer Martinez, whose brother Miguel had successfully completed his EMT training and was now working for the city's emergency medical services. Jennifer wanted to tell Sarah that Miguel had been selected for a leadership development program within the EMS department, partly based on his military background and his ability to integrate tactical training with medical care. "He says you inspired him to see his military experience as an asset rather than something to overcome," Jennifer said. "He's now training other EMT personnel in crisis response techniques, and he's considering going back to school for a nursing degree." Sarah felt moved by this news, recognizing how Miguel's story reflected the broader potential for veterans to find meaningful ways to use their military experience in civilian service careers. His success validated her belief that the integration of military and civilian identities could benefit not just individual veterans but the communities they served. As the conference concluded, Sarah was approached by representatives from 3 different hospitals who wanted to discuss implementing similar veteran integration and emergency preparedness programs. She was also contacted by a publisher who was interested in her writing a book about veteran transition and healthcare, and by a veterans organization that wanted her to speak at their annual conference about successful career transition strategies. The level of professional recognition and opportunity was overwhelming, but Sarah remained grounded in her core mission of patient care and veteran support. She had accepted a request to serve on a national committee developing guidelines for veteran integration in healthcare settings, but she had also negotiated to maintain her clinical duties at St. Mary's Hospital because direct patient care remained central to her professional identity. On her drive home from the conference, Astra reflected on the transformation that had occurred over the past 6 months. The frightening crisis that had forced her to reveal her military background had ultimately become the catalyst for a career evolution that she could never have imagined. More importantly, it had led to a personal integration that made her feel more authentic and purposeful than she had since leaving the military. That evening, Sarah worked her regular night shift at St. Mary's Hospital, moving through the familiar routines of patient care that had originally drawn her to nursing. But now these activities carried additional meaning as part of a larger mission that integrated all aspects of her experience and training. She was no longer hiding part of herself or trying to be someone she wasn't. She was simply being the most complete version of herself in service of others. During her rounds, Sarah stopped by the ICU where the Code Silver incident had occurred 6 months earlier. The physical space looked exactly the same, but she experienced it differently now. Instead of seeing just a medical unit, she saw a place where she had discovered that her military identity and nursing identity could work together to protect and serve vulnerable people.
Robert Peterson had sent her a letter the previous week, updating her on his recovery and his new volunteer work with veteran transition programs. He had written, "You taught me that leaving the military doesn't mean leaving behind everything you learned and became.
It means finding new ways to serve using all of your skills and experience. Thank you for showing me that warriors and healers can be the same person."
As Sarah completed her shift and prepared to head home, she felt a deep sense of satisfaction and purpose. The secret that had once separated her past from her present had become the foundation for a future that honored all aspects of her experience.
She had learned that identity was not about choosing between different versions of herself, but about integrating all of her experiences in service of her deepest values and commitments. The night nurse's secret had become the night nurse's strength, and Sarah Mitchell had discovered that the most powerful thing she could be was simply herself, completely and authentically, in service of others who needed both her healing touch and her warrior's heart.
Walking out into the early morning sunshine, Sarah knew that her story was far from over. She had found her path forward, one that honored her past while embracing her future, one that used all of her skills and experience in service of healing and protection.
The scared veteran who had once hidden her military background had become a confident healthcare leader who understood that strength came not from hiding parts of yourself, but from integrating all of your experiences in service of something larger than yourself. The journey from warrior to healer was complete, but the journey as a warrior healer was just beginning.